The 15th Amendment, how it impacted America. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution reads, Section 1. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2. The Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. The 15th Amendment, though not enforced for many years after ratification, was a great step in racial equality by putting an end to legal disenfranchisement and paved the way for African Americans and immigrants to take part in the American politics. Ratified by the states in 1870, the 15th Amendment of the United States made political injustices such as the grandfather clauses, physical intimidation, and literacy tests illegal at elections. Prior to 1870, African Americans were not forbidden to vote. However, discriminatory tactics were used to keep African Americans and the lower class from voting. Physical intimidation, one of the most brutal tactics, included murdering and lynching members of the discriminated class. Posting armed guards at voting polls and mob violence also kept discriminated classes from voting. Literacy tests given to all voters would keep illiterate citizens who did not have access to primary education from being eligible to vote. When an undesirable would pass the literacy test, they would often be given an unfair second test in another language to be sure that they would fail. Another common tactic was the grandfather clause, which made it so that you could not vote if your grandfather could not vote. This tactic kept the descendants of slaves from being able to vote. The final common tactic was a poll tax, or a required fee to vote. This kept the poorest of the poor from voting.
To address these issues, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, successfully ending legal disenfranchisement. One person who spoke for this amendment to the Constitution was Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave and abolitionist speaker. In his letter to Mr. Bruce and Mr. Babcock in Rochester, Douglass wrote, "Today we survey a future radiant with light and hope. We were always men, now we are citizens and men among men. We admit the responsibility of our new relation, but we do not shrink from it." Once ratified, the 15th Amendment made the voting process much more accessible. Although the 15th Amendment legally ended voting discrimination, it did not override the underlying tensions that African Americans and lower-class citizens faced in the voting process. Though voter intimidation did not end immediately, the voting situation in the polls was improved. Suddenly, the polls were less restricted, and disenfranchised classes could vote however they chose with some impunity. The Democratic Party in particular received a serious blow, as many African Americans harbored resentment towards voting restrictions previously employed by the Democrats. Therefore, African Americans were much more likely to vote for the Republican Party. Overall, the 15th Amendment was a major step in civil rights. Once given a greater measure of influence in politics, African Americans had much more ground on which to base their fight for equality. For the most part, African Americans could vote in the North. Due to a lack of enforcement, voter intimidation still existed in the South. White politicians also invented more creative ways to get around the 15th Amendment. The Democratic Party started creating all-white clubs that excluded African Americans. Since the Republican Party was non-existent in the early 1900s, only members of the Democratic Party could vote for candidates in the primaries. Therefore, the winner of the white primary would take the entire election. Today, both parties still try to influence voting by using fraudulent emails, mail, and phone calls. Often, emails are sent to voters telling them to go to a certain place to vote, only to go there and find that the email was a fraud and that they went to the voting station of another district. By the time they realized that they couldn't vote there, they were already late and had other commitments. Another hot topic today is the requirement to have a government-issued ID to vote. In the current case of Applewhite versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Applewhite alleged that the ID law deprives citizens of the right to vote. Lower-class citizens without identification, approximately 20 million Americans, would have to find a time aside from work to purchase an expensive voter ID. Other citizens that did not also have birth certificates could not even apply for identification. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, on the other hand, considered voter ID necessary to stop voter fraud. In other words, it made sure that the person casting the ballot was not someone else. The 15th Amendment, though not enforced for several years after being passed, put an end to legalized political intimidation in the late 1800s and allowed previously disenfranchised citizens to have a much larger effect in politics. African Americans as well as lower-class citizens found themselves able to have a say in the way America ran. This was just one great step in the fight for racial equality, which still goes on today.